By the late 1970s, the once heralded haven for those struggling with addiction had turned into a multi-million-dollar corporation. With its sights set less on saving lives and more on cashing in and accumulating guns, the formerly sterling reputation of Synanon began to tarnish. As soon as they began acting on their violent threats, the thin thread holding the whole group together frayed into oblivion. But the group's legacy is one thing its virulent dictator couldn't control. This week's episode is The Cult of Synanon, Part 3. Sinisterhood. Part 3, The Reckoning of Chuck Diedrich.
The Reckoning.
Or is it?
Yeah, I don't know.
Or is it?
It's so we've gotten a lot of emails from people that, and we'll talk about this, how this has led into the troubled teen industry that still exists today. Mm-hmm. And we've gotten some messages from people that either were sent to one of these programs that kind of based their whole format on what Synanon doing, or they knew someone that did, and it ended tragically for them. And so I can't call it a reckoning because, unfortunately, even when things like this might disband, the aftermath or the ideas that are planted often just spring up in new ways that are even worse than they were to begin with.
Not to mention all the various damage that happens to everybody involved along the way, which that is today, is the damage upon damage upon damage that this group, which is crazy because in part one, it was a noble effort of nobody else was helping people that needed to be helped. And we're going to see today it descend into literally madness. That's, I think, the title of the book, From Miracle to Madness, is like the most perfect thing because it was heralded as this like amazing miracle. And then by the end of this episode, I think all of y'all are going to be saying, what the fuck? How did we get here? And it's like, how did we?
Yeah, it's reminiscent of many cults that we've covered. And a lot of the people at the time even compared it to Jonestown because Jonestown happened and then kind of like shortly after, the feds were like, maybe we should look into this other one that has a lot of the same qualities as Jonestown.
And gave money to Jonestown. Synanon sent money to Jonestown,
It's like I think we've said in the first episode, all of these start off with good intentions, but all of them end terribly.
Oh, yes.
It's just, it doesn't work. It doesn't work when you do it this way.
Does not. Oh, a very brief correction. Thank you. Shout out to our Northern California listener. They say Marin County instead of Marin County. And I just want to say thank you very much for the gentle correction. We're always trying to get better. So thanks for adding that in our Instagram comments. Much appreciated.
Marin County. Okay. Well apologies to everyone from that beloved county that we have been mispronouncing it. Some things we just think we know. And other things we look up. When it's like a wild word, we look it up. But that one, we thought we had it, and we didn't. Like this group.
It's like with Loveland. I was like, it's Loveland, Frogland. They're like, we'll really say Loveland. And I was like, well, the marketing's off on that one. So sometimes
Loveland
it's just
Frogman doesn't hit as hard as Loveland Frogman. You gotta hit that
Loveland. I know. It's not all. They would argue
repetition.
that it's their city and it's not all about the Frogman. I would argue it's all about the Frogman. Well, we're not going to Loveland or to Marin County, but we're going to a lot of easily pronounceable places, like on our tour this summer. I mean, like
St. Louis, Chicago, Milwaukee.
Yes.
Yeah. I've gotten tired of it myself, so everyone else probably is also.
It's a rule of three.
For real, we're going to St. Louis, Chicago, Milwaukee, Charlotte, Raleigh, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Toronto, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, San Diego, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Dallas. And perhaps some might be added at a later date. But for now, this is what we've got, our full moon energy tour. What is that, Heather?
Well, I was just staring up at the moon yesterday, and I just saw a new article today in the Cut magazine about why we feel like the moon has a grasp on us. And that's one of the things we cover in Full Moon Energy, along with conspiracies, crimes. We talk about some cryptids. Are they, or are they real? I don't know. And we're also going to be talking about Moon Train and some of the new developments on the moon. It's our lunar sister's a crazy one. And so it's stuff you're not going to hear on the show, and it's a full show on its own. So if your friend's like, I've never listened to an episode, well, bitch, you live under the moon. You better go to sinisterhood.com/live shows and see what the hell it's all about. And in a couple of cities, there's still some VIP left, which means you get to do a 45-minute Q&A with us afterwards. And we just sit around, shoot the shit with you, talk. It's like a virtual Q&A, but in person. So sinisterhood.com/live shows. We're going to see you on the road.
It's going to be a lot of fun. It's a really fun show. Several audience participation parts.
We can't wait. I can't wait.
Everyone loves to vote on something. So
yeah. I've been gathering my
voting
things.
segments.
Yeah, I've been gathering my things. I can't wait to hear what beloved celebrity like Ben Affleck you all boo and hate on.
I feel like Ben Affleck now has turned a corner because everybody hates J-Lo so much that they kind of feel sorry for him. So maybe the Bostonians have softened a bit towards him now.
Well, we'll see. It wasn't just people in Boston. People at every stop booed when we showed Ben Affleck. So why do we show Ben Affleck? Show up and find out at sinisterhood.com/live shows.
Yes. Well, for now, we're going to wrap this up with part 3 of our Synanon coverage. A lot of people save them all up to binge them at once. So if you've just spent the last 4 hours listening to us, apologies. And we'll say Marin this time, although I don't know if we mentioned it anymore. We can retroactively apologize for that one. Well, I'm Christy.
I'm Heather.
And let's get into it. The foundation of Synanon's treatment was rooted in the game, where anything was allowed except for violence. That all changed in the summer of 1973. Founder of the group, Chuck Diedrich, and a female resident were going at each other in a heated session of the game. Frustrated because the woman kept interrupting Chuck's rants directed at her, Chuck got up from his chair, walked across the room, and poured a can of root beer over her head. Chuck had broken the one rule of the game, and now the floodgates were open.
What's crazy to me about this is, Dad's old-fashioned root beer. They specifically said the brand. Dad's old-fashioned.
I don't think I've had that one.
It's all right. You get it. You see it a lot of times at soda shops. But this is an example of, we see, what happens when somebody does challenge this person who is unchallengeable, who has become a god, and she would not back down and she couldn't be broken. People were like, it was wild. He would scream right in her face and she was just like, smug, like could not be, was just steely reserved. And so you see what happens when a bully gets threatened is that they bully even harder. And people were like, we were shocked. He apologized the next day. And then like 2 hours later, he got back on the wire and was like, I actually want to take back that apology. She got what was coming to her. She just wouldn't shut up. So she deserved it. And nonviolence was a policy. And guess what? I can change policies whenever I want.
And that is a slippery slope to change that one. That was really that and the no drug policy, which really also wasn't being taken as seriously as one would hope. That last bastion of like, we're keeping things together, we're civilized, has just now been destroyed, and it's a free-for-all.
Absolutely. He said the rules aren't for executives, they're for like the peons and the underlings. And then pretty soon the rules.
It shouldn't be true ever. No, everybody should have to play by the same set of rules in my world.
Yeah.
The door opening on violence was especially troubling for the children that found themselves at the mercy of Synanon. Members of the so-called punk squad were beaten if they disobeyed Chuck's rules or refused to participate in the game. Adults that dared say something were met with the same punishment. With the permission of violence, people's true colors began to show, with Betty writing in her journal at the time,
"We're beginning to find some creeps amongst the squares."
Yeah, I bet.
Not shocking.
I bet. Yeah, not shocking. I'm surprised that this is the first time it's really even like noted that like, maybe all these people aren't as on the up and up above board as we thought. But perhaps just that rule was kind of keeping them all in check. And now with that's gone, it's like, oh, well, yeah, turns out people that get screamed at day in and day out, if given the permission to just slap the shit out of somebody that's doing it to them, they're going to take it.
They will. And it was especially egregious with this punk squad because it was more and more children who had been labeled, juvenile delinquents or, their parents couldn't handle them. And then what Chuck would do is he was like, go find a tough motherfucker who will knock them on their ass. So then you had the people, quote unquote, running the punk squad, reforming the juveniles who were just there to just literally punch them in the stomach. Like it would say like, oh, you want to stand up to me, kid? It's the stuff we later saw on like Maury Povich that we all kind of cheered on at the time of like, look at those out of control teens getting yelled at. And you're like, no, this has lasting significant damage on these kids. But it was, of course, there's creeps because you go, hey, who wants to rough up some teenage punks? And the ones that would raise their hand are like, oh, yeah. And then Chuck's like, well, they love their job. And it's like, that's not the person who should be doing it.
No, they're like, I've been waiting for this.
For real.
Mm-hmm. As pressures mounted, both internally and externally, Synanon sought official religious status in 1974. This tactical move officially made Synanon a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. The theological message of the Synanon religion was not one of peace and love. Rather, Chuck told his followers over the wire,
we're not going to mess with the old-time turn-the-other-cheek religious postures. Our religious posture is, don't mess with us. You can get killed, dead, literally dead.
Aggressive tactics weren't just aimed towards outsiders. After a series of intense games in San Francisco in early 1975, the use of head shaving morphed from a punishment into a badge of honor and loyalty. Synanon had been shaving the heads of deserters or trespassers, but after this, all members, male and female, willingly shaved their heads to show their loyalty to Chuck and the group.
And it shows you just what a small thing can spiral into an ethos and a tenet. Chuck hit his head. He was walking down some stairs and a beam was too low and he whacked his head. And so he wrote out a memo and said, yeah, dog. But he wrote out a memo and said, whoever was stupid enough to build that beam low enough for me to hit my head should have their head shaved. He sent it publicly in a memo. So people just began shaving their heads because they felt responsible, even his son. So basically it would be like, well, I'm the one that designed that staircase, so I should shave my head. Well, I'm the one that hammered it in, so I'm the one that painted it. So all these people start shaving their heads. So then at the next day or like 3 or 4 days later, and it's all these men. Well, then at a woman's game session, this woman's like, well, I have responsibility too. I should shave my head. And then her husband had told her, you'll look like an ugly pig. So then she said defiantly, oh, fucking watch me then. So then she shaves her head. All the women shaved their head. Within 48 hours, all 500 women in Synanon had shaved their head because this announcement had gone out over the wire that was like, basically, you need to take responsibility for Chuck for whatever him hitting his head for walking down the stairs. Because honestly, he's probably drunk.
Yeah, for real. But also, what a petulant child that refuses to take any kind of responsibility or be accountable for their own actions. Instead, he is a constant victim. Everything that happens to him that's negative is because of the fault of someone else. And the message that sends to the adults in the group, the children in the group, who also had their heads shaved.
Yeah, and
all
didn't
these
want it.
Pictures of kids that are from like 2 to 16 with just shaved heads. I mean, you're telling me a 2-year-old is given consent to shave their head? No, it's just done to them. And I mean, and again, it was girls, boys, everybody. And the message is, oh, we're responsible for how Chuck feels.
Yeah.
And that is never a message that any child or other person should have bestowed upon them, that like, I'm responsible for these feelings, because then you learn to walk on eggshells. Like kids that grow up in that environment, they don't have healthy relationships. They're people pleasers. They are constantly on edge that, like, oh, well, I got to keep myself in line, or Chuck's going to get upset. And then, he's going to, next thing we know, like everybody's just getting screamed at in the game.
Yeah, no, you're right. And JD was like, his daughter, JD said, all these people had come here because they were really lonely. And so if you sort of weave in this idea that like you will get kicked out if you upset this one person, and his happiness is actually more important than the rest of, not even happiness, bending to his whims is more important.
Comfortability. Yeah, just like his rants.
Yeah, she's like the people that, because, in the later years, it wasn't so much people with substance use issues. It was more just like people joining up, paying dues and stuff to be in it. And she's like, they joined because they were lonely, and then they were like completely cut off from their outside family. So then it becomes just this huge hostage situation.
Yeah.
And you're right. Like when you leave, you're like still being a hostage of somebody who's like your spouse. It's like, whoa, you don't have to treat me like a cult leader. But that's just like sad because that's how you were programmed.
Mm-hmm. As Chuck pondered the most recent concerns with the children of Synanon, he decided that it would be best if they just weren't around. Children were expensive, and Chuck saw them as an unnecessary liability, telling residents in a speech over the wire.
There's no profit to this community in raising our own children. Every baby that we indulge a Synanon female with takes up a bed and somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 worth of energy.
For those that longed to be a mother, Chuck brazenly tried to dissuade them by remarking on the trials of childbirth, saying,
I understand it's more like crapping a football than anything else.
Shut your fucking stupid mouth.
Yeah.
First of all, you're a dude. Shut the fuck up. Yeah. You can't talk about what it's like to give childbirth because you can't do it. So just shut your mouth. And
yeah.
The hypocrisy of like, well, at first we wanted all of the residents' children to come here because I don't want to lose my free labor. So it benefits me for their kids to be here. But now I got to pay for them to like eat and stuff and have a place to live. So fuck it. Fuck them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's seriously, you're right, because they wanted factory workers. So he could make the delinquents be factory workers and abuse them and make them do, sit-ups, push-ups, act like they're in the military. But when it was people's kids, they're like, well, I wanted my daughter to go to college, which, okay, a little bit hypocritical. And it was just like, no, you're head sucker is what they call people that wanted to spend time with their kids. And he wanted workers. He said it was like, he wanted to get rid of the non-productive members, and he said he called it squeezing out the rotten fruit. Like it was just like culling the herd.
Yeah, thinning the herd, squeezing out the rotten fruit. And meanwhile, his own kids only see him because they're in this cult as well. And
he's half the time there's videos of him gaming JD, like screaming at his daughter in her face.
It was basically he, in his mind, legalized emotional and verbal abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he didn't want parents to be around their kids because he wasn't around his kids. And so he's retroactively being like, well, I did it the right way. Society told me I was wrong. But in my new society, the way I did it is actually the right way. And you have to do it that way. So, yep, no more kids.
Worried his words wouldn't be taken seriously, Chuck took his anti-kid movement even further when in 1976, he declared that all men were to receive vasectomies and all women who were pregnant were to immediately have an abortion. Unsurprisingly, the vasectomy rule applied to everyone except Chuck.
Because they had just rooms of people, and they, over the course of 3 days, gave vasectomies to pretty much all the men over 18 who had been there, for such and such amount of time.
And that's, yeah. Over 18, you're so young. I mean, can it be undone? Maybe. There's camps on both sides, depending on if it can or not. But
they were doing it in the house. Like, it was at home.
I think you're doing something you can't undo. And so you make a decision at 20 that for the rest of your life now, I mean, in 10 years, you're like, damn, I actually do want kids. And then you're like, I can't undo that. Your hair grows back. Your vas deferens do not, as far as I know.
No, and especially not when it's done by like a homemade, even though they were doctors, they were still doing it in these Synanon facilities. And Mike Gimbel is one of the guys that had talked a lot on the Synanon fix and had kicked heroin because he was there. And he said he got a vasectomy and he's like, I literally didn't know what the procedure was when they rolled me in there. And pretty much if you resisted, they would game you and scream at you until you relented. And he said 3 days after the mandate, they found out that his partner that he had been partnered with was pregnant. And he's like, we looked at each other and we're like, well, we have to go through with the abortion, even though they both thought they wanted to have the kid. But he said, you know, at the time we were like, this is what's right for the group. And he's like, now my brothers all have grandkids. And I just think about what a life I would have had. And you're right. Like, that's some of the untold ripples of harm that a group like this does. Of like, Mike's not the only Mike. Like, he's not the only one that's like, man, what if I had grandkids?
And those in the moment heated decisions that you might think like, well, this is a good idea. And like, you know, you're forced in the moment to do it. But no one is looking at long-term physical and mental effects of that.
No. And nobody was like, hey, Mike and spouse, let's talk about what your likes and dislikes are. What are your goals for life? It was like, you will do this in 3 days or you will be kicked out. And they were like, okay, I guess we have to do it in 3 days. And it's like, that's not the same thing as consent. That's coercion. Yeah.
And then it's kicked out and you've been told, if you ever leave this facility, you'll die.
Yeah.
You know, and Mike's been clean off heroin. So you're like, fuck, if I go back on the streets, I'm just going to get right back into that. Like, I mean, they've got a grip on you in like every way. They just have control over your life.
It's just a hostage situation. Yeah.
Feeling the group was under attack, in February of 1977, Chuck created the Imperial Marines, a private security force inside the group, and developed Sindu, its own type of martial arts. Chuck named the group in honor of Betty.
Her Majesty's Imperial Marines.
And Betty was often at their training. The group eventually committed over 80 violent acts on former members and random neighbors. With Chuck's paranoia and penchant for violence escalating, he began amassing guns, with Synanon eventually buying more firearms than any organization in the history of California. The tenets of Synanon were clearly shifting, with the focus less on rehabilitation and instead on preparing for a doomsday scenario. Chuck's fondness for overalls had also morphed into a militant-like uniform for residents, and members shaved their heads as a sign of loyalty to the group. What once resembled the makings of a utopian society now looked more like a dystopian sci-fi film.
And at this time, The Wire was playing these speeches from Chuck that he would just, it was everywhere, even in the bathroom. And he would be like, we're under attack. They're trying to get us. We're in red alert. So one guy was like, yeah, I would sleep in my overalls. Like they wore their like full ass coveralls. And he's like, I would sleep fully clothed because Chuck was like, you don't know whenever the attack call is going to come in the night. And then sometimes they would have drills. So you just get like, we are being invaded. And you have to just jump out of bed and start fighting. That does something to your brain. Chuck also said he really liked to keep people from sleeping because he's like, the brain is so, he goes, the brain's so malleable when they don't sleep. Well, yeah, you're torturing people.
Yeah, that's called torture. And they do it in all sorts of torture scenarios to get people to confess to something under duress or just make them lose their wits about them. That whole part reminds me a lot of Nexium. Just like Keith Raniere calling them in the middle of the night and making them come do stuff, or just refusing to let them sleep, or having these drills in the middle of the night. I mean, it really, lack of sleep is more dangerous than, like, driving a car when you haven't slept is more dangerous than driving under the influence of a drug, because your brain just doesn't function properly. And if you are sleep deprived and being told we're under attack by who is even attacking you, the outsider, neighbors. It's this very like us versus them mentality. It starts to become this very, you're getting into like a Branch Davidian situation. Getting everybody hyped. And that's what one of the insider guys, like, he was like on the board with Chuck. He goes, we were really open that we had that many guns. Like, we wanted it to be publicized because we wanted him to say, don't fuck with us. And one of Chuck's Wire speeches, he goes, oh, well, when you act in uniform, it freaks people out. So he said, wearing the same clothes, shaving our heads. He also got really into fitness and weight loss at this point. He was like making people like do jogging kind of before jogging was cool. He was an early adopter, but like having them like jog and running in uniform. It looks like North Korea kind of stuff, like where they're marching in unison. But he said, oh yeah, we do that so that they'll be easier to control. So they're saying out loud, we have a ton of guns. And also look at our guys like working out. The ranchers nearby go, we could drive by and see that they were shooting at human cutout targets. So it's not like they were out hunting practice. They were like army practice. They're preparing for something.
Yes. It's like this ball-headed overall clad prepper group up the street. And but meanwhile, you're like seeing like Chevrolet just donated $1 bajillion to, Chrysler and Procter and Gamble, like all these big legit companies were meanwhile donating, because Chuck was really good on the sales side, being like, oh, well, that all the marching and stuff is all the dope fiends and we're keeping them clean. But he literally around this time, like spring of 1977, admitted, yeah, we don't really do rehab anymore. Like that's all just kind of made up. And he's like, we created this organization to where basically I could just have a top heavy organization where all the money's at the top and I don't have to pay taxes. So,
well, he did just that. And it's wild that he was just so openly living this lifestyle for so long. And it was allowed legally, like the state didn't step in. And it's when the sheriff's deputies are also Synanon members. Yeah. You've got the whole law enforcement in your back pocket, and people knew that. So they didn't even want to call and report stuff, because then he'd send his fucking cronies out there to beat the shit out of you.
Yeah, sometimes Synanon would donate ambulances, so the Synanon members would beat the shit out of locals, and then when the first responders would come, like the police would come, they would say, oh, do you want us to call the ambulance? And they're like, no, because it's a Synanon ambulance, and I don't want the people who just beat my ass to come and pick me up in the ambulance. And they're all bald. It's a horror movie. It really is. All of this is a horror movie.
He's not wrong about the uniform thing. There is something about seeing people in uniform that does something different. It's because it looks more evil, like everyone, because you're like, these are all one person. They don't have individual thought anymore. Like everyone is aligned with one thought, and that is just us versus them.
Yeah, it's like, what does Chuck want? Essentially, they were his arms, and they would go out. They would put on wigs so that people wouldn't know it was them, because they're bald-headed people. They all kind of knew. And don't get me wrong, I think some people rock a bald style very well. But these folks did it for intimidation purposes and honestly to beat lineups. So they would all kind of like look the same, so then a victim couldn't really point anybody out of the lineup. Yeah. But they would put on wigs and civvies, like civilian clothes, and go hunt down people they thought might have escaped from the group. It was just like, and like you said, the cops were like, well, we're outnumbered A and B. Two of them are deputies. So what do you want?
You really have no one to call to protect you. It's terrifying. 2 months after the formation of Her Majesty's Imperial Marines, the woman for whom the group was named lost her battle with lung cancer. The passing of his wife sent Chuck into a spiral of destruction. He immediately announced that he would accept applications from any women who wanted to marry him. 6 applied, and he eventually chose a 31-year-old. Chuck was so pleased with the experiment that he mandated all married couples must separate from their partners, whether they wanted to or not, and choose a new mate. To avoid complacency, Chuck instructed this was to take place every 3 years.
This is what got some people to quit, because they've been married. Someone was like, I've been married to this lady for 28 years. I'm not leaving her.
No. And then I got to find somebody, and then I got to find another person in 3 years. Like you're leasing a car. Like, I mean, that's exhausting to keep trading in somebody. Yeah.
He also did it with his own kids. He told JD, your husband's not very good at business, so you're actually going to break up with him, and I think you should be with Lance or whoever, some random guy. And so he did it. JD basically said in an interview, he basically broke up both mine and my brother's marriages. Like that kind of control. Horrible. Where over 300 couples eventually broke up and mixed up. My concern was for this 31-year-old. She I think was real in it. She was a school teacher, and one of her students was like, "Oh, I was in her class when she got the call," and she was like, "Hallelujah, I've been chosen."
Chosen as his wife?
Yeah, to be Chuck's like replacement wife. And then he couldn't finish the deed. He couldn't finish the deed, and so I don't know how that got out. I guess maybe did she yell at him in a game or he yelled at her? Somehow it got out that he was unable to finish in bed. So then he decided, he was like, listen, no one's going to have orgasms anymore. You should all be edging. I have been containing my power in me by just edging. And if all of you would just edge. And then in Paul Morantz's book, he wrote, this did not catch on. Like, he was trying to save it. That's a hard one
to get people to agree to.
Yeah, he was trying to save it. But, it's another one of those things where it's just like whatever whim he had, he would be like, well, now everybody does this.
Or whatever affected him. Like the whole jogging and stuff and running in place and the health kick, it's because his doctors were like, your heart is going to explode. You smoke and all the time.
Scream.
You drank your whole life. You're screaming, your blood pressure, you're overweight. Like, you got to do stuff here if you want to keep going. And so instead of just doing that, he's like, well, if I got to do it, everybody's got to do it.
Yeah. The same with working out. It's, you're right. It's like, okay, well, now you all have to jog. Now you can't smoke. Now you all have to get new wives. Yeah. It's just the Chuckisms. And this post-religious declaration, they started collecting everything he would say in these little summaries. And then they created this fellowship where you could like go and study all of Chuck's teachings and so it's just further deifying this person who really is just kind of like decides things on a whim.
Yeah. No, he's an abusive person and sounds like he has been his whole life. I mean, from taking over the AA meetings and kind of just like holding court that nobody asked him to hold. And then it just kind of morphed into this thing where, like so many others, it's like your intentions might have been in the right place, maybe in the beginning. But once you get a taste of that power and money and control, it just... If you already had the propensity to like let that make you become a horrible person, it just is like a snowball.
No, you're right. It's those testing those edges too of like, oh, okay, well, if I tell them they have to get a vasectomy, will they do it? What if I tell them they have to get a divorce? Will they do it? So it goes one further. And one thing I took umbrage with in some of the interviews with former members, like current day interviews with former members of like, well, you could leave any time. And this was right around the time in 1977 when you could not. Like they started getting, because you knew too much. So if you wanted to leave, you suddenly were not able to leave. Or if you left, your new job would get phone calls and be like, did you know this person's a sexual deviant and they were like wife swapping in this cult that they were in, and ratting you for stuff that you did at Synanon at your new job when it's like, I just wanted to leave this behind. So I find that rings false too of like, well, it was a voluntary group. Anyone can join. I'm like, absolutely not. You were coerced to stay. And if you left, you were like chased down.
Yeah.
If they thought you stole something, they would fly across the country and beat your ass. Like that's how like you hid out when it was raining in our basement after you've abandoned us. So therefore that's stealing from us. So now we're going to beat your ass.
In the summer of 1977, a housewife living in Santa Monica named Frances Wynn was struggling with depression. She dropped her husband off at work on June 6th, then headed to a family planning clinic to try and obtain a tranquilizer. The clinic explained they couldn't help with that type of medicine and instead sent her to Synanon in an act of malpractice. As Frances wandered on the beach near Synanon, a neighbor warned her if she went in, she would likely not come out. Frances entered anyway. She was taken into an upstairs room for orientation. Without her consent, the Synanon resident shaved off her waist-length hair, further sending her into a mental spiral. She was then locked into an apartment and not allowed to call her husband, who was at home by this time and worried sick. He had no idea that his vulnerable wife was in the grips of a violent cult. The next day, they put Frances to work chopping vegetables and gamed her aggressively, shouting at her that all her behavior was wrong. Frances was then put on a bus and shipped to Marin County. While there, she later recalled blacking out at times, being in such distress. Frances went into a full psychotic episode, which kept her from believing any of the Synanon dogma. Eventually, a Synanon member called her husband to explain she was there to
do something with her life.
Her husband begged to take her back home and even showed up in person to demand her release. He was denied both times. Through a friend, Frances's husband met lawyer Paul Morantz. On their first call, Paul comforted the distraught man and guaranteed he would get Frances back. When Paul tried to reach out to the licensing authority to complain, he found Synanon was not licensed by any authorities at all. Paul negotiated a call between Frances and her husband. On the call, Frances said she wanted to come home. Paul demanded her release. Synanon agreed, but only if Frances signed a release of all legal claims against the group. When they came to pick Frances up, Synanon had not drafted a release. Paul quickly drafted one by hand, using language friendly to his client, and Synanon signed it. Paul then sued Synanon on Frances's behalf. The suit alleged kidnapping, false imprisonment, and attempted brainwashing. The latter, which Paul recognized as
never before asserted in a California court.
Chuck was furious. On the wire, he called Paul out by name, providing a much-needed lifeline for those who would leave the group. Chuck asked over the wire,
"Who is this guy, Morantz? Why didn't someone break his legs?"
This is horrifying to think that this poor woman who was just seeking help, before she knows it, she has her head shaved and she's locked in a room and can't contact her husband. I mean, that is diabolical. That would send anybody into a psychotic episode.
Right? It's like a horror film, truly, that she went to one place for medication and instead of being referred somewhere appropriate, was referred somewhere that had just sort of gotten this like nebulous positive. Nobody really was checking. There were no licensing authorities. It was skating under the radar kind of thing. And then all of a sudden she's halfway across the state chopping vegetables and they're telling her she can't come home. Paul Morantz was the perfect person to call because he had previously had success busting the lid off of a scam where nursing homes were kidnapping guys that were living on Skid Row suffering from alcohol use disorder, and they would basically kidnap them and stick them in these nursing homes and then bill the state and say like, oh, we have nursing home patients, but really they would just be bodies, physically people that were just being sedated, like abuse, like for money. And Paul Morantz is the one that uncovered this and sued them. And so it was like when Francis's husband was like, I think my wife is kidnapped by a cult, his friend's like, I got a guy. And Paul Morantz was like, so the guy for this, because he's not so private about it. He's very public in his book. He's like, I really actually wanted to be a screenwriter. That was my dream. And I ended up being a lawyer, but he was a really good storyteller. Mm-hmm. And the thing that gets people to change their mind about things or to open their eyes to things is never like yelling or petitions or facts. Like it's always story. And I think he was really good at saying like, no, this woman was kidnapped. And the only way that I got her out was by literally kind of tricking them on a napkin because they were tricky. They would just move people. The fact that he even got them to bring her to meet in person was wild because for kids, they would move them. If a parent left and wanted their kid back or whatever, they would move them locations.
It's hard for me to wrap my head around like a husband going to a clinic and saying, I want my wife back. And they're just like, no. And then
get out,
you're
by
like,
the way.
Fuck. Well, okay. I can't call the cops because they're getting paid off by this guy. Like what the helplessness that you feel. And also it's so illegal. Like the hubris that these people think like we have every right to do this is wild.
No, and I think you're right. They had so much confidence that they weren't going to get busted for anything because in Marin County, they weren't getting busted for anything. There was such a small county with such limited resources. They were just like, oh, sorry, we would do something, but maybe just give them some probation. Maybe just let them like plead no contest. And if they don't do it again, it'll be okay. Well, down in Santa Monica and like Los Angeles County, it started to be more, what the fuck's going on? No, you can't bribe all of us. Like you're not Scientology. You can't keep us all in your back pocket. So I think they started seeing courts that were not as friendly to the Synanon people down there. And also Paul Morantz had a good reputation. So it wasn't like it was some Yahoo coming in saying like, you got to make sure that they were like, oh, this is the guy that blew the lid off the Skid Row issue and saved all those people. He's probably on to something. And he had also made like good journalistic contacts with that last story. So then while Synanon was still getting great press from a lot of other places, he was able to get reporters to write on them truthfully, especially about all this Francis Wynn stuff. And Chuck was like, I wish he was dead right now and his whole family. It's like very, he became like Al Capone of like, I want him dead. I want his family dead. I want his house burned down. I want everything. Like he thought he was Don Corleone. He was really obsessed with The Godfather. He loved that movie.
It's a good movie. I won't argue with that. By November 1977, Synanon was increasingly violent and not facing consequences. The Imperial Marines, as well as everyday members, would seek retribution for perceived slights against the group. Some infractions were as innocent as accidentally veering into the lane near a Synanon vehicle while driving. The group would run down locals and inflict violent beatings on them, knocking out teeth, drawing blood, and damaging property. Alvin Gambonini was from a ranching family nearby. His property bordered 2 Synanon compounds along a 2-mile stretch in Marin County. The group had an easement to use a road through Alvin's property. At first, they were friendly with the rancher, but then Synanon began encroaching on Alvin's land, stealing fertilizer and cutting locks on his fences. Worst of all, Alvin and his wife played host to kids fleeing the punk squad. The crying, scared youth would arrive on the Gambinini's doorstep at all hours of the night, pleading for help. Group leaders had told the younger members that ranchers like Alvin would shoot them on sight. But one teen girl crossed a fence at 2 a.m. and told Alvin she wasn't afraid to be shot because...
What do I have to lose?
Instead, the Gambininis were extremely welcoming. Alvin and his wife would buy bus tickets with their own money to get the kids back to waiting relatives in other cities and states. The couple would routinely receive thank you letters, and in some cases, reimbursement of their expenses from grateful runaways and their families. In June of 1977 alone, 30 kids between the ages of 11 and 18 ran from the Synanon facilities, according to testimony from the former president of Synanon, Liz Masakian.
Those are not good numbers. 30 kids in 1 month is not good numbers.
And bless these people. My goodness, you're having already to deal with like the worst neighbors one could possibly imagine. But if it were me, I would also feel kind of like a debt to stay there just to help these kids, because like, if not us, who then? You know, like you're kind of their only saving grace, and you're able to help, you know, when they come to you. So as horrible as it would be to live there, I would also be like, but I got to help the kids that do come looking for help.
Right. And you also, I mean, in the Gambininis, I believe his family had owned that land for like 75 years. You're like, this is my family farm homestead. Like, I'm not leaving just because y'all moved in. And it is a complete microcosm of what they did to the town of like, they are like, oh, we have an easement across your land. No worries. And they just stuck to that easement. And then a little bit more, moved a little bit more, moved a little bit more, moved. And then we're like, we're cutting this fence down, by the way. And he's like, well, actually, but we're doing it. So good luck. And there's 10,000 bald-headed people in overalls that are ready to literally beat your ass if you say anything about it. So he was already crossways with them, trying to kind of assert his legal rights. They didn't like that. And then especially on top of it, knowing that the kids were running to him, he's like, I first called the sheriff, and the sheriff's like, okay, well, we'll just take him back. And we were like, no, don't do that. So he would just tell the kids, okay, well, who do you want to call? Do you need a bus ticket? Like, what can we do? And they like read letters out loud in interviews of like, dear Mr. and Mrs. Gambinini, like I wouldn't have lived without you. Like, thank you so much. I made it back to, you know, Portland or Colorado or wherever their families had sent them. And like you said, you would feel, and you could tell the Gambininis like are indebted. They were like, those kids didn't deserve that. The people in charge of them are assholes, but those kids didn't do anything wrong. Like, let's let them. Yeah. Sinisterhood will be right back. My favorite spring cleaning takeaway is the post-clean clarity you get. Wow, how have I been living like this? It's kind of like when you find out that you've been paying a fortune for wireless. When Mint Mobile has phone plans for $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. Wow, how have I been affording this? It's time to switch to Mint Mobile and get unlimited talk, text, and data for $15 a month.
All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts. How convenient is that? You don't even have to change phone numbers.
Super convenient. The Sinisterhood official phone is a Mint Mobile cell phone, which is perfect because we're about to go on the road and we don't have to worry about where we're going to be traveling, whether we'll have good coverage or not, because Mint Mobile has excellent wireless service. So we don't have to be worried about, oh my gosh, is it going to work? And it's unlimited. And also we're saving a bunch. We're a small operation. We can't spend $1 million on our phone plan. So thanks to Mint Mobile, we're covered on all of the delivery, cost, location. It's got it all.
All of them. Checks all the boxes. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/sinisterhood. That's mintmobile.com/sinisterhood.
Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/sinisterhood. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. Speed slower above 40 gigabyte on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Sinisterhood will be right back.
One evening, Alvin was attacked with his family in their car. At first, it was a handful of Synanon men. Eventually, over 36 bald, denim-clad Synanites ran at the family, wielding axe handles. One neighboring witness said it looked like a scene out of A Clockwork Orange. In the end, Alvin had one tooth cracked, another chipped, a muscle in his arm torn, and 2 permanent scars on his face. In additional incidents, neighbors were beaten, kicked, had their tires slashed, and were robbed of wallets, jewelry, and clothing. Black victims were called the N-word. Each time, Synanon residents would plead guilty and be given probation, a small fine, and perhaps a week or 2 in jail.
And that's what it was, is they beat the shit out of this other farmer who then went to go point him out of a lineup. Well, meanwhile, Synanon, because they had somebody in the sheriff's office, knew the lineup was happening. They had a Dave lookalike contest, and they got all men to grow their mustaches out to look like this one Synanon member. So then in the lineup, the rancher's like, well, shit. Yeah. They all look now. It was the one with the mustache. Well, now they all have mustaches, and they did it on purpose. So then the DA's like, well, sorry, I have to drop charges because you can't identify who your assailant is. And they were doing this. Alvin's like kids were in the car. His son was like, I was terrified. I ran out of the car and got a neighbor. They were trying to pull Alvin out of the car, smash the back windshield, smash the side windows. It turned into this, I can't overstate. It's like a riot situation in this small town where these people would just be sleeping, and all of a sudden 5 Synanon vehicles would just descend on their house, flip the lights on, and then inside of each of those vehicles was 5 or 6 people. So then all of a sudden you have a mob of 30 bald-headed people in fucking coveralls with just like pipes and flashlights beating you.
No, yeah. It's a total mob mentality. And also, part of me wonders, like, were these people kind of just ticking time bombs? I mean, you've had all this anger going on in this group, and Chuck liked to think it was expressing it and getting it out there, so you're healing, or it's making everything way worse, and everyone is just so pissed off now and has so much rage inside of them that now you give them a baseball bat and permission to go apeshit, and they're like, say less, and just go and terrorize this town.
Yeah, you're right. And by this point, anybody that would even say, well, I don't, Chuck told us we should do that, but I wasn't sure. You were supposed to report them, and they had to get immediately kicked out. Chuck was like, there is no questioning. You either accept it fully or you're kicked out, and you are not allowed to come back in. And we'll, in fact, essentially strip you naked and beat the shit out of you and throw you out when you got kicked out. Because it was Synanon's clothes. Like, that's our clothes. That's our stuff. And so, yeah, you're right. When you get people that are juiced up under orders that are like, the orders are defend Synanon. He said, basically, you have to beat their asses and say, don't fuck with Synanon and tell your friends. And I was like, well, now you're kind of admitting that it was you.
Yeah,
but then anytime they would,
because they don't get in trouble.
They didn't.
A week in jail or a fine, that's nothing compared to like getting to do the stuff they were doing.
And Synanon would pay your fine. And then they also instructed, hey, Synanon said, when you got to get arrested, be like, oh, the group didn't tell me to do this. I acted alone. And when you're the cop, you're like, nuh-uh. Like, it's like, well, how do you prove it?
Also, the sheriff's deputies are members, but you also get to play the martyr and be, a hero.
You're a hero, yeah.
But the lawsuit on behalf of Francis Wynn seemed to open the floodgates. Alvin Gambonini sued for damages related to his attack. A local trucker who had been pistol whipped by a gang of Synanites sued as well. Several of the victims were represented by Chuck's new number one enemy, lawyer Paul Morantz.
And you think about if you're in the cult and you're like, I'm trying to get out. And on the wire, Chuck's like, Paul Morantz is the son of a bitch who's going to bring Synanon down. The second you get free, you're like, just operator, give me Paul Morantz.
Go into a phone book. In December of 1977, Time magazine published a scathing article calling the group
a kooky cult.
Chuck instructed his own lawyers to sue for $78 million. He was unnerved by the negative coverage and multiple lawsuits from injured people. At a party at Marin County journalists Dave and Kathy Mitchell's house that same month, a man whose father was in the group commented,
"It looks to a lot of people like Chuck's going crazy." And December 1977, he thought he was going to get Time Magazine Man of the Year. He thought he was going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Connie Chung was interviewing him. Time was interviewing him. This is giving such Jeff Divine fucking immediate when Vanity Fair comes out. It's like, oh,
complete delusion. Yeah.
Yes.
He's like,
such an
wait a
idiot.
minute, I'm not Time Man of the Year. Instead, I've been labeled a kooky cult leader.
Yes,
Times
it is
kooky cult leader of the year.
It was a Jeff Divine moment of like, they are an enemy now and we're going to sue them. But it's just this, it's crazy how the behavior is the same just 40 years later. Somebody's trying the same shit, or 50 years.
Yeah. And it should also be noted that, I don't know if he was as open about it at the time, but later it was pretty well known that after Betty died, he was just openly drinking. Or maybe not
vodka.
openly in front of everybody, but he was certainly drinking and was drunk all the time.
And like halfway incoherent, the board member said, well, yeah, we would bring him, he would want vodka and water. So people would think he was just drinking water. And they're like, we mixed as much water as we could in there. But it's like, he knew he was drinking. He wanted to be drinking. So yeah, that mixed with getting called a kooky cult. No, he
Plus
was.
all this power and control and just, I mean, I'm sure with that power and control also comes a huge amount of stress of what you're doing in this organization you're running. So he was a ticking time bomb. The whole thing was.
No, and you're right. And I think they're added to that stress was at this point they had like 400 vehicles, cars, trucks, motorcycles, 3 boats, 3 properties, 900 people in Marin, 6 airplanes. They had a donated computer system that was worth like $200,000, and they had already bought. We'll talk about their guns here in a minute, but they had all this. He had a ton of assets that he was managing, and also managing it as a tax exempt entity. And I think he knew, and his attorneys were like, this isn't going to last for long. Like the IRS is going to figure this out. So then this is right around the time that he started trying to restructure money, to move money to himself and to the other board members. He's like, you're going to be so fucking rich. It was his daughter's son, and then some other insiders. But people were paying to be in this, like a couple $100 a month. And so there was still money coming in from AdGap, from that. So I think he started, I won't say seeing the writings on the walls, but it was like, the IRS is going to get wise to this. Like, let's essentially launder money to ourselves.
It's a lot of moving parts to keep up with, and which is difficult at any time. But when you're drunk and mentally spiraling, it's even harder.
Over with.
In January of 1978, Synanon bought 172 guns, weapons, and ammunition from a gun dealer in San Francisco for a whopping $60,000. Chuck defended the purchases by telling news outlets that there were threats on his life following the bad press from the Time magazine story. Chuck told reporters at the time that he couldn't be responsible for what angry members did in retaliation.
I don't know what these people might do. I don't know what action they might take against the people responsible, their wives, their children. Bombs could be thrown into odd places, into the homes of some of the clowns who occupy high places in the Time organization. Don't be saying bomb in an interview, Chuck.
As the negative press mounted, so did Synanon's counterattack strategy. Chuck instructed his legal department to change the defendant names on the libel petitions and begin suing any media outlets that covered the group in a negative light. This practice would prove to be his downfall. For a man who was constantly recording himself and creating internal memos detailing acts of violence and abuse, legal discovery was a scary thing. Opposing counsel began demanding to inspect the group's books and records as part of the lawsuits. Giving an adversary access to the group's records was tantamount to a confession. Instead, Chuck instructed Synanon members to begin destroying documents and tapes rather than reveal them to their opponents. In some memos and tapes that were not destroyed, Chuck instructed members to commit violence, take personal responsibility for it, and never reveal Synanon's involvement. He made it clear that anyone who went to jail for Synanon was a martyr like himself and should be treated as a hero.
They're not heroes, but the people that had to delete all of Chuck's stuff, it was like Lucy and Ethel in the Chocolate Factory, because as soon as they're like shredding memos, he's just making more memos. They're like, he sat down at breakfast at 5:30 or 6 a.m. in the morning. This motherfucker would start talking with a mic in front of him and would not stop. And it would be someone's whole job to just transcribe it. And he would say things like, I want Paul Morantz destroyed and I don't care who knows it. Okay, well, now you're just
can't
like...
say that. And
making
you can't
open threats.
have it on record, you moron.
Yeah, you took the audio recordings and then they would transcribe them and then they would take the transcripts and then they would put them in these summaries and then the summaries would be timed and dated and all this. So you were just creating like this huge long discovery log for either criminal or civil investigators.
Somebody starting to talk to me at 5:30 a.m. and then talking to me until, I don't know, midnight, and then probably waking me up in the middle of the night to do a drill. I'll kill you.
Yeah, it would be like this woman was arrested for killing the head of a cult. I mean, I would lose it. But I mean, I guess you're so ingrained. You're just so ingrained.
Yeah. It's more a
with
commentary on how I can't handle anybody talking to me that much. I got to have my own downtime. And especially, he's piping his voice into the bathroom. You're like, the one place I can have a little bit of solitude when I go to have my morning constitution. And it's like, no, I want Paul Morant's dead. Just that voice, the bullfrog croaking, just screaming in your ear constantly.
Yes, almost like Mid-Atlantic-ish too. To me, he gives like, I think I said it in one of the other ones, like Barnum and Bailey, kind of like, like, hey, step right up, folks.
Mm-hmm. That salesman, that circus performer in him. As a result of the press, a grand jury was convened to look into the group's practices and make recommendations for enforcement to the county officials. The bombshell report was issued on March 3rd, 1978. The grand jury concluded it was inappropriate for the sheriff to deputize the Synanon residents. It also urged authorities to look into allegations of child abuse and the legalities of Synanon's security force and arsenal. It described Synanon as
an organization that has changed from a benevolent group of rehabilitated addicts to an autocracy which refuses to observe the rules of the very society it proposes to help. Over a period of years, obvious changes have taken place, and materialism seems to have altered Synanon's underlying philosophy.
With all the negative press and now the lengthy grand jury report, some residents found it odd that local law enforcement was not harsher on the group. An internal source admitted to the Point Reyes Light that the county attorney was terrified of Synanon's litigious reputation, so they weren't even enforcing zoning violations anymore, much less investigating child abuse. Plus, at least 2 Synanon members were sheriff's deputies. The district attorney also claimed child abuse was not in his jurisdiction. Synanon, it seemed, could act violently without any criminal repercussions.
And I think this is a perfect example of, you called it a slippery slope earlier, when they move in and the county's like, well, because the grand jury was in Marin County where they had kind of this Tamales Bay, like this big facility. When they first moved in, they're like, well, we'll give you a zoning exception for 18 months. And in 18 months, you have to give us this plan. Well, they didn't give them a plan in 18 months. And in 18 months, they had expanded like 5 times the size they had already been. And by then, the little small government's like, could you maybe please give us the plan? And they're like, no, we will not. And so it's like, so now you're in an area where there's a miniature town of people that can do whatever they want and have begun arresting your citizens. Like Marin County people would just be driving down the road, and if Synanon thought you looked like somebody who maybe harassed them, they would pull you over and kidnap you and take you back to their facility, beat you for however long they wanted, and then come and drop you off somewhere. And if you complained, it would be like, well, I mean, they let you go. So also, which one was it? And you're like, the bald one in the overalls. And they're like, yeah.
About that. Yeah, it kind of gives Murder Mountain, like, law enforcement's just outnumbered at some point, and they're like, or it's also like many of the episodes we saw on Inside the World's Toughest Prison and that we covered in one of our minisodes on Patreon, that like even law enforcement in prisons become outnumbered by the violence that the prisoners are, they're in charge. So you're kind of like, all right, you're right. Y'all make the rules and we're just everybody's going to try to coexist. But it's like, nah, man, the people that are supposed to be like protecting us should be the ones that have the most force behind them. And that's just not the case. So if you're a resident there and you're not a Synanon person, you're just trying to live there, you're living under a complete regime of fear that you didn't sign up for.
You're right. And the other real rub about it was these bitches weren't even paying taxes. They had tax exemptions on everything, not even federal income tax, which pisses me off. But for the folks around there, they were not paying property taxes. They were surviving off property tax, not surviving, but they were benefiting from property tax exemptions. Which
Meanwhile,
means now
stealing the
Yes.
Gambininis fertilizer and stuff
Yes.
who are paying property taxes.
Yes.
So they're mooching off of the people that are even like abiding by the rules.
And they would say like, oh, but we provided you with this ambulance and we provided you with this fire truck. And it's like, but arguably the strings are attached because you are creating the beatings that necessitate the ambulance. So that's not really helpful.
You're creating the need and also providing the help. And it just doesn't make any sense. Like just eliminate. And like, also, why do you have a fire truck and an ambulance? Like they shouldn't even have these things. And I agree that they should have been looked at much harder. And the charges that came against them should have been much harder. Who the fuck is ever going to say as a district attorney, child abuse just isn't in my jurisdiction? I'm sorry. It is. Like any type of whatever is going on that's illegal, if it happens in your jurisdiction, you are the one responsible for taking care of it.
You're right. And the local officials who did push for the grand jury obviously suffered repercussions. Synanon would always call people and hang up. They would say they were going to kill them. They would drive by their house, shine lights in the window. So the elected officials and law enforcement who did not enforce these laws, and they're responsible partially for the abuse of all those kids that happened to.
Oh, for sure.
Because the Gambininis knew from the first one that ran off what was going on out there and was like, sorry, kid, you can't call the cops. The best thing I can do for you is a bus ticket. So that like large systemic failure is always really hard to see.
Yeah, everybody failed them. Mm-hmm. One of the many violent criminal attacks occurred against a former member in 1978. Once a Synanon resident, Phil Ritter left the group after its focus shifted from one of rehabilitation to one of control and violence. Hoping to escape the grips of the cult, Ritter moved to Detroit after leaving the group. His wife stayed, along with the couple's young daughter. Desperate to save his daughter from the cult, Ritter sued both Synanon and his wife in an attempt to gain custody. Unfortunately for Ritter, Chuck had instructed his Imperial Marines to compile a, quote, hit list of any former member that tried to slander the Synanon name. Phil Ritter was on this list.
And Phil was interviewed in the Synanon fix and was kind of high up in the group and had been there for a long time. But really, it was like this vasectomy thing. And like after that, like, okay, now you have to get rid of your spouses. It started. So he left like in January of 77, really when all that stuff started taking off. But that's got to be the hardest fucking thing when you're like, my kid, what am I going to do?
My kid and my wife who...
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? You might still love her. You want to also save her, but you can't. But like your kid is a different story. And you're outnumbered. Like their threats of violence and just being like, nah, you're not going to take her. Like, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You know?
And Paul Morantz had to help this grandma get 3 kids out. And it took him like literally tricking them and not putting his own name on the position to even get Synanon to bring kids, because Marin County sheriffs, anytime they would have like basically a writ that says custody wise, you got to bring the kid in. The sheriffs would go, yeah, we can't serve this. They're not going to listen to us. So sorry. So Paul Morantz would have to like trick him to go to whole different counties to deliver kids and stuff. I mean, that's how bad it was. This is I don't ever want anybody with their like kind of rose-colored glasses looking back going like, well, it wasn't that bad of a group. It tore families apart and worse to Phil Ritter.
Yeah. Yeah. Worse to a lot of people.
Yeah.
On September 19th, 1978, Imperial Marines Alan Hubbard and Joseph Musico showed up to Ritter's home, who was now living in Berkeley, California. Using wooden mallets, the 2 men viciously beat Ritter in his own driveway. The Imperial Marines only fled once a crowd of concerned neighbors began to form. Luckily, Ritter survived his life-threatening injuries.
But I mean, his skull was crushed. He spent a week in a coma.
Yeah, in a coma, yeah.
They thought he might not live.
Oh, I'm surprised he did. I think unless people started gathering and were like, what the hell's going on? Or if these 2 men had more of them there and, it's an angry mob, they're like, get back in your houses. You don't see anything happening here. Like, he would have died. I mean, it was just people coming out and kind of, maybe they felt like, well, we've sent our message, don't fuck with us again. But meanwhile, his kid's still in the cult.
Yeah, and his neighbors all had to see that happen and go, it was 2 bald guys.
That's traumatic. And it's traumatic to see that kind of stuff, like that ripple effect of like, you don't forget seeing your neighbor get the shit beaten out of him with a wooden mallet in his driveway.
No, not at all.
After Phil Ritter was clubbed so hard by other members, he was put into a coma in September of 1978. Paul Morantz was scared for his safety, telling the publication Paleo Future,
"When they did Phil Ritter, I knew that it was inevitable that they were coming for me. That was the hardest 2 weeks of my life."
On October 10th, Paul met with the California Attorney General's office to discuss the credibility of threats against his life. After the meeting, Paul headed back to his home in Los Angeles, where he planned on watching Game 1 of the Yankees-Dodgers World Series. Earlier that day, Paul's neighbors had seen something strange, but didn't want to bother him at work. A green Plymouth executive sedan was slowly driving down the street. At one point, it stopped, and a young man exited with a parcel. He shoved the parcel into Paul's mailbox and left. It seemed like a legitimate delivery, but Paul's neighbor noted the car's license plate just in case. Around 5:30 p.m., Paul entered his home. In his book, From Miracle to Madness, Paul described his mailbox as a chute on the outside, leading to a metal grid opening on the inside. Without his glasses or contacts in the fading light, he thought he saw a long scarf or oddly shaped package with his mail. He headed over and opened the box with his right hand while reaching in with his left. A rattlesnake, with its rattle removed, bit him on his left wrist. Can you begin to imagine? Can anyone begin to imagine? You go, I opened my mailbox the other day and a wasp was in there and I lost my shit. Imagine if a 4-foot rattlesnake was coiled inside of there and you put your hand in and it immediately strikes at you.
4 feet. I think McGruff is 2 feet. So
it's 2 of McGruff.
It's 2, if you think of how long McGruff is, and he's long. I'm holding him up for those of you watching on YouTube or ad-free on Patreon. I mean, that's
you
one.
McGruff for scale here.
McGruff for scale, 2. 2 McGruffs.
And just those fangs, and his rattle had been removed, so you don't even hear it. And also, let's not forget how scared the snake must be. The snake didn't ask for this. He's had his rattle removed, which is how he protects himself and warns people like, hey, I'm here. Don't come at me. He's put in a bag and shoved in this thing. He doesn't know where he's at. And then, of course, they kill him afterwards because
there's a snake loose.
Of course they did. Yeah. I mean, so it's terrifying, but it's also very sad that they involved a helpless animal that had nothing to do with this. And what a fucking crazy way to also try and kill somebody.
It's very eerie, and the scarier part is earlier in the day, that Plymouth got stopped 2 different times by 2. In one case, it was stopped by a police officer. In one case, it was seen by a car that it just seemed kind of weird because half of its license plate, the letters were like taped over so that from far away you wouldn't be able to write the license plate down, but still some of the letters were enough. But then another different cop pulled it over because of that same thing, and the cop searched the car, including he opened the trunk, and in the trunk he just saw a canvas bag because the snake was in the bag. Thank God the cop wasn't like, you mind if I look in this bag? I mean, the cop would have gotten bitten.
But he should have looked in the bag. How are you going to search a car and not look in the canvas bag?
Yeah, he probably should have just searched the bag. But they took that. It was a Tulare County rattlesnake. It was the type of rattlesnake that's found in the area where Synanon had facilities that was not Los Angeles. So it was not native. And its rattle had been removed. So it was there to not be seen, but to be felt. And boy, did Paul Morantz feel it because he got it. The wrist, man, because your veins are right there.
Yeah,
it's pumping blood.
God, and like the last thing you're expecting when you reach in to get your mail is a snake biting you, the terror. And then I'm also like, what was the end game here? Like, if he dies, then what? What is the story of like, a rattlesnake that's not even native to this area was in his mailbox? Like, they're going to come looking for who would have motive and question you. And like, how are you going to explain that away? Somebody saw you put this in the mailbox earlier in the day. There was no really like thinking things through. It was all very like in the moment, just knee-jerk reactions to things.
Well, and of like, you know what'll really show them? A rattlesnake. And like you said, they don't really extrapolate it to its natural conclusion. It's like, no one will ever know it was us. We'll just put tape over our license plate. But luckily, Paul had told his neighbors. The thing after Phil Ritter, he was super paranoid. He's like, every time I started my car, I checked underneath it because I didn't know if there was a bomb. I looked over my shoulder.
He loves the Godfather.
Yes.
So,
yes.
There you go.
So he thought he was going to get shot, honestly, or blown up because he Chuck liked the Godfather mafia stuff. So he's like, I bought a shotgun. Paul said, I bought a shotgun for my own house. I had my 2 dogs. Luckily, the dogs weren't bitten by the rattlesnake. They ran out of the house. But he was living this like paranoid life. And one of those things was telling his neighbors, hey, if you see anything, just like note it down. It might help me. And it was very helpful when 2 different neighbors were like, it was a green Plymouth and this was the license plate.
And good for those neighbors for understanding the assignment and looking out for him.
Sinisterhood will be right back. Everybody know there's some things in your life you have to compromise on, whether you're trying to like figure out where you're going to go eat with folks, whether you're going to figure out like, oh, can I live in this new apartment I moved into when these people upstairs will not stop salsa dancing and tap dancing and doing the Irish jig right above me. I can't live like this anymore. Or it's a really good location close to the lake. Maybe I'll stay. But things like your health, you can't compromise on something like that. So if you've had a doctor that's just like talking about themselves their whole appointment or isn't paying attention or is texting your whole time, don't go back just because they're available. You deserve better.
And we often go back because it's such a beating to try and find a new one. But with ZocDoc, they've made it so simple that you don't have to settle anymore. You can find the doctor that works best for you. Just check out ZocDoc, the place where you can find and book doctors who will make you feel comfortable, listen to you, and prioritize your health. And you can search by location, availability, and insurance. So literally no compromises here because with ZocDoc, you've got more options than you know.
I love that we can put our insurance in. I love that we can search what's local. And I really love those reviews. I'm not like, even like buying stuff, I've never really been big on reviews. But once I was on ZocDoc, I was like, well, dang, I know for sure these people have seen them. So I don't think it's I don't have to worry about if it's just some rando on the internet. It's like, you have seen this. It's patient verified. It's a real person. I can trust it. And guess what? I even go and check reviews on doctors I already like just to make sure they're good. ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare highly rated in-network doctors near you and instantly book appointments with them online. We're talking about booking appointments with thousands of top-rated, patient-reviewed doctors and specialists.
You can filter specifically for ones who take your insurance, are located near you, and treat almost any condition you're searching for.
Go to ZocDoc.com/creepy and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today.
That's ZocDoc.com/creepy. ZocDoc.com/creepy.
Sinisterhood will be right back.
Paul screamed and ran out the back door of his house. Quick actions by his neighbors had Paul at the hospital with antivenin within an hour. After an investigation, police determined 2 Synanon members, Joe Musico, 28, and Lance Kenton, 20, were responsible. Paul Morantz made sure that tapes of Chuck making threats on the wire were played openly in court so that journalists could get the story out. In addition to LA County DA's office prosecuting the rattlesnake case, a multi-agency task force was also set up by the governor to look into all the other many allegations against Synanon.
Yeah, his neighbors were like a task force so fast. They all ran outside when they heard him screaming. One neighbor called 911. Another one ran and got ice. And then a third had just done snake bite training. Like, talk about the weird universe coming together. And so stripped his shirt off and used his shirt as a tourniquet to stop the venom from like coursing through his body. And then a fourth one was like, you got to cut it and like bleed to essentially get the venom out. So he was helping with that. So it was within like 10 minutes there, the ambulance was on the scene. They were like treating it. His first words were like, Synanon did this to me. It was Synanon. And he also began yelling the name of an LA Times reporter who he had been working with because he was like, I thought they were going to go after her next because she had been basically publishing anything Paul had sent to her. But he was very smart, I think, in having the tapes of Chuck played in public because he said, I didn't want them to ever deny that he said those things. A memo you could deny, but he said, I knew if I could get the audio of his his voice, the same one that talked to the governor, the same one that talked to all of these, like, you know, civic organizations that he was like, I'm the only one who cares about these people, to have the audio of like, I want Paul Morantz's legs to get cut off. Like, that was powerful. And there's footage of like Connie Chung was really on the case. And in a lot of this footage, like feverishly writing it down because they couldn't get sued for libel for reporting a tape was played that said this. Essentially, it was just a way to, Paul Morantz was just giving
facts, baby.
Yeah. He was just giving them ammunition.
By then, Chuck had been drinking vodka daily, beginning in early 1977 when Betty was first diagnosed with lung cancer. He had moved with his new wife, Jenny, to properties the group owned in Lake Havasu, Arizona. There, he remained in a psychotic, alcohol-induced stupor, sometimes unconscious, other times having conversations with his dead brother by the pool. Chuck Diedrich was arrested on December 2nd, 1978, charged with conspiracy and solicitation to commit murder and assault with a deadly weapon. He was barely conscious in the early hearings, sometimes audibly snoring. This led a judge to declare him temporarily incompetent due to alcohol abuse. Musico, Kenton, and Chuck all pleaded no contest. Musico and Kenton spent a year in the LA County Jail. Chuck, meanwhile, received only probation because his doctors claimed that due to ill health, he would most likely die in prison. As a condition of probation, he was disallowed from taking part in managing Synanon. He stepped down in name, but continued running things behind the scenes as his daughter JD took over as chairman. I don't know if this is a hot take, but I'm going to say it. Who gives a fuck if he's ill health?
Yeah.
Die in prison. Like, I mean, if you did all of these things, like, why do you get to now not suffer the consequences of your actions? And why are you ill? Because of all the things you've done to yourself.
Yes.
So it's your own doing.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a heartless monster, but like all of the things he's done, I'm like, okay, so you're in ill health. So are a lot of people in prison. You still did the crime. You still got to do the time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I thought this was a really light sentence on all three of them. Paul Morantz was like, you know, I kind of understood I'm glad that they got some jail time, but the judge goes, well, you can't really know the reasoning for why they put that snake in your mailbox. Maybe it was just to scare you. And Paul Morantz was like, if it was to scare me, they would have left the rattle on.
Also, who cares if it was just to scare you? You put a
poisonous
snake in somebody's home. That's trespassing.
Yeah.
A deadly weapon. And it bit him and nearly killed him. So who gives a shit what the reasoning was? Yeah,
I mean, the judge was kind of like, well, you know, there's not enough. I'm like, well, I think there's plenty here. I don't agree with the Chuck getting off as light as he did, especially given his ill health. Spoiler alert, he didn't die within however many months of probation he would have gotten. So it's like, to me, he should have had time in jail.
Yeah,
he should have, for what he's done. And this was only the tip of the iceberg of all the, you know, the snake bite was the most salacious of all the things he did. But as the task force kind of moved in on them, I think it started to become, by this point, the FBI started exchanging memos like, we should be, because the state task force called the feds in and were like, there's a lot of stuff with taxes and like money and wiring and stuff. And the FBI is like, all right, so the Sacramento FBI office starts looking into it. So while I do think Chuck absolutely should have gone to jail more, maybe that was part of it of like, oh, well, he'll probably go down for something else, which shouldn't be a consideration for a judge. They should punish you for the thing you did in front of them.
Yeah. It's kind of just more of him getting off scot-free and not having to pay any restitutions for all the damage he's caused.
Mm-hmm.
That next year, in 1979, the tiny local news organization, the Point Reyes Light, became the smallest newspaper to ever win a Pulitzer Prize for its relentless reporting on the group.
And truly, it was between the Point Reyes Light, Paul Morantz, and the journalists that worked with him that were willing to do actual journalism and look into things versus taking Chuck's word. Because up until Time Magazine and these other outlets that came out with negative stuff, it was like they just would print whatever Chuck said, and he was lying a lot, including between the time after he gets kind of let go for the rattlesnake, him and JD and his son and a bunch of the board members all went to Italy and spent like months and months in Italy drinking a ton. He's like, we're drinking, we're eating good food. What's the matter with all that? We're having a good time. And there's just footage of him like chilling in Italy, having a great time. They even wrote a Synanon song about the city in Italy where they were at. So even though at this point, I think now the most stringent like supporters that have no grip on reality, diehards are left because Chuck making a video, he made a wire speech about how, I'm really sorry, but his wife, Jenny, he said, quote, her nut hole wouldn't open up. Yeah. This is why you have to watch it on YouTube because Christy has just crumbled into her own hands. Yeah, he said her nut hole wouldn't open up and did not open up for 13 by God months. But when they went to Italy and got drunk, then all of a sudden, that's when it.
Oh, I don't think I've ever heard somebody call it that. And
what happened was
I
earlier.
don't think he's even saying it in a funny way. I think he probably just refers to it as that. Like it's a scientific name for it.
It's like when LBJ talks about his bunghole in those old tapes, and he's like, my knife is falling out, and it's too tight around my bunghole. Mm-hmm. He's like, well, her nut hole wouldn't open up, and then we went to Italy, and I was like, save Jenny. I want her to be rescued. No one deserves to have sex with Chuck.
I think her body was physically like not allowing it because she knew she didn't want it to happen, and her body was like shutting it down.
It's a fucking nightmare. But I had to know that phrase, so now you guys all do too. Sorry. Thank you. But this is a burden we share together.
Suspicious of Synanon after the litany of bad press and lawsuits, the IRS began looking into its tax-exempt status. The government hired none other than Paul Morantz to act as a consultant, as he had gained a wealth of knowledge about Chuck and the group through litigation by then. In May of 1982, the IRS officially revoked Synanon's tax-exempt status, retroactively back to 1977. This meant that the group owed taxes on all income during most of its supposed church days for a total of $17 million. Though Synanon appealed, the loss was affirmed by an appellate court in 1984, and the group was ordered to pay up.
Yeah, they were still going during these times, and there's footage of them still trying to have games, but the people that were still there said it kind of turned into this like weird spectator sport where there would be multi-camera setups with live producers switching between footage and people watching it on TV, and then Chuck could chime in via a voice box, but people couldn't talk back to the box. So like people would be in the middle of a game, and then he would just like buzz in and be like, careful not to say da-da-da-da, and then they were just like, let us continue. It's the box. So it had like just become this match. Like, this kind of like weird. And then they just have to start kind of like selling all their properties off. And it just becomes like this kind of sad thing that JD is kind of like running, but she wasn't really. I mean, Chuck was still running it, but drunkenly, constantly yelling.
With such huge financial hits, Synanon could not continue. The Marin County property was dismantled in March of 1983. The legal troubles continued for the leaders of Synanon, including Chuck's 2 adult children. In October of 1983, a D.C. Superior Court judge officially found that Synanon destroyed documents and tapes relating to the rattlesnake attack and its lawsuit against the San Francisco Examiner, among other incriminating acts. The group's civil case, the one that caused the discovery in the first place, was dismissed. The board came under criminal investigation related to the destruction of evidence. Finally, in 1983, 13 Synanon leaders were indicted on federal charges for deleting incriminating tapes, charged with conspiracy, concealment of material facts, obstruction of justice, and perjury. Defendants included Chuck's daughter, Synanon president Liz Masakian, one of its top lawyers, Dan Garrett, and Synanon loyalist Miriam and Phil Burdett, among others. They were also charged in LA County Court as part of the cover-up. Chuck, his 2 children, and other elders were also charged with violations of security laws in Arizona. None of them served jail time for their transgressions.
Yeah, that's what it's just so many shenanigans going on that I wonder if the government's just like, well, probation here, probation there, and not realizing like it's different jurisdictions. It should all be.
Well, and that makes them idiots. Because how do you have all this information and evidence and nobody's going to jail, especially Chuck?
Yeah, that's what I never got, is that Chuck was able to never really be, except for back in for his Santa Monica
when he chose
zoning
to
days.
go.
Yes, yeah.
It's just these people got away with so much for so long, and so many people that needed help just were failed by countless agencies, especially the kids.
Oh, yeah.
Facing financial collapse, dwindling membership, and numerous legal convictions against members for violent crimes, Synanon officially disbanded in 1991. 6 years later, the man who founded it all died at the age of 83. After a series of strokes, Chuck Diederich died on February 28, 1997. The cause of death was listed as cardiorespiratory failure.
And as a reminder, in 1978, he was too sick to go to jail because he might die in there for 5 years.
He lived until 97, so fuck that.
Yeah, he did get dementia really bad in his later years. They said he didn't really recognize anybody, and him and Ginny just moved to a trailer park outside of where the old facilities were down in Visalia, and just kind of like faded into nothing.
Although Synanon closed its doors in 1991, the concept of tough love being the best course of treatment for troubled teens had been introduced and would soon take on a horrific life of its own. Chuck's most lasting legacy is the unfortunate continuation of Synanon's practices. Starting well before any rattlesnakes made their way to mailboxes, groups across the country copied the Synanon model. Even after Chuck and his group were convicted, disgraced, and bankrupt, dangerous camps across the troubled teen industry had sprung up using Synanon practices. Attack therapy is still practiced today in places that call themselves
emotional growth boarding schools.
CEDU, the controversial school at the focus of NBC's podcast, The Lost Kids, was founded by former members of Synanon. Schools like The Seed applied Synanon methods to teenagers in Florida for nearly 30 years. This month, troubled teen industry alum and outspoken advocate Paris Hilton issued a warning.
To any parent considering placing your child in the troubled teen industry, please do your research. It has been proven that this industry has significant deceptive marketing that aims to capture your attention in your most vulnerable state. These facilities will also label your children as liars and manipulators and prevent confidential communication with them. My biggest recommendation is to trust what your child says instead of taking the side of these oftentimes corrupt facility owners you have never met, running facilities you have never been to.
Truly, this is just heinous. And I mean, it's no surprise to anybody. These troubled teen industry camps are just horrible. The program on Netflix right now has a series on them. And what's so wild, but also speaks to the long-term damage and hold that it has on you, is one of the kids that grew up in Synanon later went on to form his own camp for teens and hired former Synanon members and people to run it. So some people were just so corrupted and brainwashed that it just led to them doing the same to others. And even if those people didn't open their own places, others sure glommed onto the Synanon way of doing things, and really just these poor kids. The troubled teen industry is one of the most upsetting things that still just goes on in plain sight.
Yeah, thank God for Paris Hilton and groups that she works with to really, and she made those statements at it was a press conference because 2 boys escaped from a place and in fact had said, call Paris Hilton. And she said, I'll be there. And she flew there on her own dime, in the middle of the week, just was like, I will be there. And she's like, if kids need me, tell me and I will show up, because you're right. The Mother Jones article, which we have linked in the show notes, kind of talks about the genealogy of the troubled teen industry, and the granddaddy is Synanon. Like it all branches out of Synanon, and then what's branched out of, but still when you trace it back, it's Synanon. And that we might put that on our social media as part of our carousel slides, just so you see just the branching tree and how it all just goes back to Chuck and Synanon.
Yeah, and he would have never been able to know that is what would happen, but
no,
man, it's so diabolical how just the seed from one man's brain could lead to something that decades later is still such a horrific industry.
It hurts
makes
so many
tons
people.
of money.
Makes tons of money and hurts so many people.
Yeah. Ex-members have been outspoken in processing their time with the controversial group. In 2020, the lead singer of the rock band The Airborne Toxic Event, Michael Jolet, released Hollywood Park, a memoir of his childhood growing up and escaping from Synanon. The Paramount Plus series, Born in Synanon, debuted in 2023 and follows another child of the cult, Cassidy Arkin, on her journey to discover the truth about the group. Max's The Synanon Fix, released in 2024, features on-camera interviews with many insiders, including Chuck's daughter, Jadie, and one of the men who allegedly placed the rattlesnake in the mailbox, Lance Kenton. In 2004, Badger Creek Development purchased the 71-acre property formerly owned by Synanon. Under the new owners, plans to build the Sequoia Resort were drawn. Utilizing the former dormitories to house 67 vacation rental units, the resort would also have a community building and swimming pool. Although Chuck began the group with seemingly noble intentions, by its end, Synanon became a source of abuse, violence, and pain for the many lives it impacted. Some former members who joined to escape addiction still maintain that without Synanon, they would have died. However, Chuck's decades of abuse and his legacy of destruction with the troubled teen industry complicate what some call their salvation. Early adopter Mike Gimble, who successfully remained clean from heroin after joining the group in its early days, summed it up on the Synanon Fix.
There's no doubt in my mind that I'd be dead if I didn't go to Synanon. Synanon saved my life, but at the same time, it screwed it up too.
So what do we think?
Well, it's no surprise that later on, once Chuck got arrested and finally was able to be analyzed by a court-appointed, the judge was like, why is this guy passed out in my courtroom? And they figured out that he was formally diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which it seemed like JD really got some comfort. His daughter got some comfort out of that because she said on the Synanon Fix, he was suffering his whole life in a way that wasn't really defined, understood. He was self-medicating. And she said, now that I know the signs of bipolar, essentially, she's like, it completely fitted. The cycles, like he would change his mind about stuff and he would need to move. He would constantly move where home place was at. He was really restless. He would change things, change rules and stuff. So I will give her credit that she wasn't saying like, we didn't really do anything wrong. She even says in it like, I didn't know what was happening with the kids, but on paper it said I was in charge of the school. And she said, on the one hand, I wish I would have known, but she said, I have to grapple with the fact that what if I did know? And I probably wouldn't have done anything about it. And I had a lot of respect for her that she did not retroactively cast herself as some like would have been hero.
Yeah.
Because I think she can see that she was just as much kind of under everybody's thumb. And it's that question of when are you a victim versus a perpetrator? But she fully participated in the Synanon Fix. When I was looking, I think it's UCLA has like an oral history project where they've done sit down interviews with like Chuck Jr. and like other members. And she had donated a lot of recordings to that. So it seems like she's really open with trying to get the truth out and not trying to sugarcoat and go, I didn't do anything wrong. She was like, oh yeah, we were getting drunk. It was terrible. Because I think you see in footage, she was getting yelled at too. It wasn't like she was doing the yelling. I'm sure she also did yelling, but there's plenty of footage of him just yelling at her. But it was weird to me, the amount of people who to this day will like love Chuck. Like they love him. They cry when they talk about him. He was a dad. They miss him.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of cognitive dissonance between, well, he saved me, and so I'm going to kind of look the other way about these other things that he did. Or you justify it like, well, it was that tough love, and that's what cured me, so I get it. Other people needed it. And as far as JD and Chuck Jr., I mean, even as adults, they're still his kids, So, I mean, you've got multi-layers of abuse and control and a power imbalance going on with that whole dynamic. I agree that it was admirable that she didn't cast herself as a hero. And because I think she has enough self-awareness to be like, I wouldn't have done anything if I had known. I couldn't have done anything. I would have, and if I had tried, I would have maybe been killed, or like one of the
thrown out at the very least.
The kids said, I knew full well that if I tried to leave, my dad would have me killed. Like, I mean, it was just like accepted, and they didn't make apologies about it, how they treated the kids or how they treated each other. And once that floodgate was open of like, well, now you can act upon these violent thoughts you've been having, everything was done. So.
No, for sure. And they had a lot of programming and conditioning from the kids that were born into it, as well as, the punk squad and the ones that came in. But there were like essays found that were quote unquote schoolwork that the Synanon kids were doing that would be like, Chuck Diedrich is an amazing man and he wants to save all of us and he's our hero. And they would get an A on it. So it's like all it was just like further indoctrination. So I think that was one of the big sad parts about Synanon overall, is that for maybe 15% of it, it was a legitimate place. And the rest of it was just fucking bullshit lies that were literally the ramblings of an untreated person. Like it was a person who desperately needed mental health care and wasn't getting it, and was in fact able to, through whatever, literal bullying, screaming at people, was able to grab onto as many resources and as much power as he had, which included the power of, to this day, when they were interviewing Lance Kenton on the Synanon Fix, who he would not say that he put the snake in the mailbox, although I think he did, because like he was identified the cops, it was a car, yada yada. But he said he's never, told anybody whether he did it or he didn't. The person interviewing him was kind of like, but did Chuck tell you to do it? And he's just like, it wasn't under his direction. I don't think he would have done it. He was a moral man. And the fact that this guy, in the year of our Lord Beyonce 2024, that you're going to say like, oh no, Chuck Diedrich was a moral man. Are you fucking joking me right now? Go deprogram yourself. Every person that was in that group, you all of you shoulder the burden of what happened to those kids. And it's between you and your maker, whoever you think that is, to fucking sort that out. But goddamn, for a fucking second, get some perspective to just be like, the other ones too, like I said, they were all crying about him. And I'm like, you got to look at it. What this has, the impact and the effect on it, the physical violence, the shit that you did to the ranchers, to the locals, you beat them, their families, the families you kept apart, the kid whose parent left, and the custody agreements you got into. You were a part of it, and like take responsibility for it, and don't continue to deify fucking Chuck Diedrich.
I think you have to hold two truths in your hand at the same time. If you're one of the former residents, like, yes, he helped me get clean, but also he was a horrible person that did a lot of horrible things. And a lot of people I knew, including maybe myself, took part in that. So you can't just stop it, but he helped me get clean. And then that justifies all of his other actions, because it's great that he helped some people get clean. Great. But that doesn't give you the right to go and do all the other things that you did. And I also think people got clean in the beginning because that's actually kind of what the focus was on. But after money started pouring in, it just became, it was just to the wayside. And that's not where the focus was anymore. So then, and then you're letting people in that are just there for a fight club.
Parties. Yeah, fight club. Yeah.
And voyeuristic purposes rather than trying to get help. So it became something that it didn't at all start out as. And it just turned into just a ball of destruction that just wreaked havoc everywhere. And one of the worst parts for me is that no one was really punished except for the people in the group and the kids. Yeah. But like none of these people that did this, I mean, a year in jail here or there, probation or fines. What is that really when you look at all of the crimes that they committed?
Yeah, Chuck Diedrich should have been in jail. He should have been in federal prison for decades. He should have gone.
How did he, the physical stuff out of it, the tax fraud and the wire fraud, like how did he just skirt past all of that?
No, and I think the question we should have is groups like this, we should all have a more discerning nose when something is presented to us as this like be all end all fix with this. It's perfect. Don't question it. It's so good. It's so perfect, because that's what he didn't get questioned for so long. But that's a great, to your point. Yeah. At the end, I don't know why he didn't go to jail for tax fraud. I don't know if the government had something else to worry about or whatever, but it does seem like they should have gotten significantly more punishment than they did.
For sure.
And
It blows my mind that they didn't. I mean, people get, years for weed. And like this guy did tried to orchestrate murder several times. And just, the list goes on. And really kind of just got a slap on the wrist, whether it was because he was paying people off or they were like, well, he's old and sick, whatever, he'll die. No, he didn't. He lived for like 20 more years.
Yeah, that's what really got me. I was like, oh, okay, they're going to let him off on probation because he was so ill. And it was just like, you can live off of rage and Chivas Regal for, I don't know, however many years, like a couple of decades, it looks like. But yeah, it really bumps me out because at the end of the day, the most vulnerable people, which is juveniles, people with mental health issues, and people with substance use issues, are the ones that lost out. Not to mention the tax-paying public, the rest of us, who these shits got to go and skate on their federal taxes for a long time. I think their stuff got, liquidated to pay it off there at the end, but they still owed us the whole time they were operating.
And like a ton of people they owed would have been dead by then,
right?
People they owe money to, they're not around anymore to see it, or the people they've took their kids and shipped them off to another place. Like,
the lives stolen.
This guy's a real piece of shit.
Chuck Diedrich
he's one of the biggest pieces
the
of shit we've covered in a while.
Yeah, in terms of sheer destruction that he was able to wreak on people's lives. And, thinking of the Mike Gimbles of maybe I would have had a kid and I would have grandkids now, but for Chuck. And Julie Ehrlich was I think she did paralegal stuff in the legal department. But she, to JD's credit, after Chuck kind of went off the deep end and was not really running things and JD was in charge, Julie said that JD pulled her aside and said, you got to get out of here. You got to run. Go to LA. She said, go live your life, be happy, and let me know what it's like, but get out of here. And Julie's like, I thought that was so weird. She said that to me, but she said, now that I think about JD was never going to be allowed to leave. Chuck put a rattlesnake in some guy's mailbox for much, much less than leaving and turning state's evidence against him, because he really did, I think, position himself as this mafioso. So holding his own daughter hostage, I think, you don't think anything's wrong with that. So
life. You see your mom get killed in front of you, and then you got to go live with your father who's addicted to alcohol and in charge of this crazy cult, and that's what you're forced to grow up in.
And steals your life. Yeah, steals your life. So I'm happy to see, like I said, her being open and willing to share her story. And she seems like she's very well adjusted insofar as how she's able to talk about her dad. I cannot say that for the other elder insiders of the group that are on there. I'm like, why don't you talk to whoever JD talked to? Because she seems like she's doing better. And the other ones that are just
think, for sure. Yeah.
Oh yeah. But the other ones just being like, oh my God, he was like my dad. I miss him. And it's like, you can't ever give somebody a free pass. So I think we as a society have to decide that, addiction to substances is not a moral failing. It's something that we need to take care of. Offenders of all kinds, juvenile offenders especially, though, that are vulnerable, have got to be protected, taken care of, and only sent to places where there's government oversight and whistleblowers and people that can report on what happened. And so the kids don't have to run next door to some poor rancher at 2 a.m. and hope he can buy him a bus ticket home.
And bless the people that are those people that take those kids in, and the helpers.
There's a special place in heaven for the Gambininis, for sure.
And in whatever hell you believe in, for people like Chuck Diedrich and all those that did his bidding for him.
For Chuck Diedrich, I hope his hell is just he has to come back again in Synanon, but as an underling.
Right.
And then he just has to live that for eternity, being screamed at. He's a kid in the pump squad getting kicked in the guts. I hope so, for eternity.
Yes. Well, that's our 3 episodes on this one. So thank you, everyone, for sticking with us through these. And I was wrong. We did get to correct ourselves and call it Marin County a couple times. So
we did. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening and for sending in whenever you do send us in our gentle corrections, because we love to get better. We're always trying our best, but nobody's perfect, especially not Chuck Diedrich, even though he thought he was.
I like to think we're better than him.
100%, because we're self-aware and we don't, make everybody do everything that we do all the time.
No, and
you can if you want.
I hate loud noises. So the last thing I'm going to host is a game at my house.
Scream party?
Screaming at each other. That's my worst nightmare. God.
No, it really is. It's just can we take the volume down about 50%?
The amount of times on the way back home yesterday that I was like, how about we just play the quiet game? And no one wanted to play but me. But that would have been my game. I'm like, okay, we're going to play Chuck's game. And now we're going to play the quiet game where everyone just disassociates and just stares at a wall for an hour.
Just stare off and think about something nice.
Mm-hmm. This episode of Sinisterhood is made possible with the help of our amazing patrons.
If you're interested in supporting the show, consider joining our Patreon. You'll get access to ad-free regular episodes, weekly bonus content, you're able to vote on episode topics, join our monthly live streams, and more.
Keep it creepy.
Mwahaha.